Hi everyone, my name is Rashid Adams. I'm a musician and ethnomusicologist and scholar, producer, composer, songwriter, all of those things. So Madagascar is an absolutely fascinating place. On those T-shirts with like that icon of Africa. What often happens is you'll see that Madagascar, which is a pretty large island, it's sometimes like left off those T-shirts. It's a place that's often not considered as part of Africa in like larger studies of Africa, etc., etc. But it's an absolutely fascinating place, like a rich natural history, rich cultural history, and rich musical culture as well. Where Madagascar's story begins is like 180 million years ago, when it used to be part of the continent of the supercontinent called Gondwana, which had like Africa, well, obviously Africa as we know it today, and it was like this colossal landmass which included Africa, India, even like Australia, Antarctica, and around 180 million years ago it started to like spread apart due to continental drift and the tectonic plates, etc. Long story, well, obviously, but all you need to know is Madagascar used to be part of Africa, and it essentially split away from around 80 million years ago to where it is now, 400 kilometers away from Mozambique and around 5,500 kilometers from India in the south, and then 7,500 from like the Southeast Asian peninsula. Due to this continental drift, what happened in Madagascar is the island's separation from, the other continental land masses. It basically resulted in this unique array of like flora and fauna, animals, plants, etc., developing and evolving in isolation from like the rest of Africa, for example. So you'd have like today, one thing that's synonymous with Madagascar today is like the lemur. So people always speak about, oh yeah, the lemur, and 90% of their plants, for example, their flora and fauna are actually endemic to Madagascar. Endemic meaning like in the Western Cape we talk about fynbos, and we're like fynbos is endemic to the Western Cape, meaning it's found in no other places in the world. And yeah, in Madagascar, 90% of what is found there is like this fascinating thing, and it's endemic, only found in Madagascar. The one thing about this is that Madagascar, in like popular culture, it's always been considered kind of with this exotic lens, like this exotic place with these exotic creatures and plants and all those kind of things. Another actually really amazing one, there was this, before European settlers arrived, there was this massive, kind of like an ostrich-like creature, and it's documented. They even have like fossilized eggs. They're like massive. Imagine making scrambled eggs with that. This giant eggs, and they're literally like the size of like an elephant or something. Their bodies. It's absolutely crazy and fascinating. Anyway, where Madagascar really came into like popular culture was in 2005 when DreamWorks released their animation called Madagascar. It's that animation with Ben Stiller. He's the lion. I can't remember the lion's name. I don't know if you've seen it, Joe. Yeah. And then I think Chris Rock, he's the zebra and this and that. And I think he's a zebra, yeah. And there's a whole thing that happens, and then they meet. They're actually animals from Bronx Zoo in New York, and then they end up, I can't remember where, they're being taken to somewhere. They end up on the shores of Madagascar. And even for them as like animals who are obviously in a zoo in like a Western country, they're like, whoa, this place is exotic, etc. And the one interesting thing, like kind of if you almost like critically engage with the film, is you'll actually discover the film, which is set in 2005 when it came out. And then there's been like Madagascar 1, 2, 3, whatever since. If you actually critically engage with it, you'll see there's actually no humans in this place called Madagascar. There's just these animals which are like, oh, those are Madagascan animals. And this is kind of this like idea of leaving all the humans in Madagascar behind. It's kind of a thing that has become quite common with Madagascar. Unless you actually pay attention, then you actually like focus on it and research and everything like that. And then digging into that, looking at the people of Madagascar, which are called the Malagasy. So in Madagascar, if you're talking about like an object or a thing, like say like vanilla, which is famous, you talk about Madagascan vanilla. But if you're talking about a person or the people, they are Malagasy people, Malagasy. Just a quick thing. And also their language, the language that they speak is also known as Malagasy. You don't say, oh, you're speaking Madagascan. No, that's not a thing. Yeah, looking at the human populations in Madagascar, as much as the natural environment is fascinating, the social, political, even religious environment and Malo in Madagascar, it's absolutely fascinating. They have about 20 plus minus 20 different like ethnic groups, like separate cultural groups, ethnic groups, and their history is really, it's one of Indian Ocean contact. So I mentioned earlier how Madagascar is the closest to Africa compared to the other continents, only 400 kilometers from Mozambique. But if you actually look at the culture of Madagascar, including, of course, the musical culture, it really reflects like a cross-continental influences, obviously from East Africa, also from the Arabian Peninsula, and also from Southeast Asia. And there's been, amongst scholars, amongst just researchers and just people generally speaking, there's this conversation around Madagascar's earliest settlers, right? Because obviously if you're on an island and it's 400 kilometers away from, the nearest land, you can't like swim there unless you're like a Iron Man or Iron Woman or whatever. But there's been this question around how did the earliest settlers get there, right? Because a place like Mauritius and Reunion, for example, which are also Indian Ocean islands, way smaller than Madagascar, but they kind of neighboring islands, so to speak. They were said to be, when the French first discovered them, they were said to be unpopulated, to the extent that Reunion, which is very close to Mauritius, it's today, believe it or not, I still don't believe it. I was there when I traveled to Madagascar in 2017. It's still a part of France. So France is way up there in Europe, and then there's this beautiful, gorgeous Indian Ocean island that is a part of France. But the reason why they'll say that is because there was no indigenous population there, which we trust, we believe in. Okay, humans. So Madagascar, on the other hand, when the first people to arrive was, I think, just after 1500, it was a Portuguese explorer or explorers, and they arrived there, and there was culture, there was population, etc., etc. So there's been this question, probably for the last 100 to 150 years, around Madagascar and its settlement. A lot of it, I would say, kind of stems from European arrogance, just in the sense that, and with all due respect, just in the sense that there's been this conception that like only Europeans could have developed a vessel large enough, to travel from here to there, a few hundred kilometers over the ocean, and then Madagascar came, which I'll mention, shows that it was actually settled by people who were obviously not European, but so-called ethnic peoples, as a European at least may say during those times. It's been this question. It's like, well, who are the earliest settlers? And that's a whole debate and, discussion for another day. But one thing that is fascinating is there have been, over the last even few decades, there's been like significant research trying to answer this question. And it's gotten to a place where scholars are actually at the point where they're like, there's enough evidence that suggests probably around 500 AD. Which, remember, this is 1,000 years before the first European ship left wherever, Portugal, Spain, England, etc., to go discover other places. Sorry, forgive my stuff. But there's this around 500 AD, and a group of probably, Indonesians. I say Indonesians because obviously today it's Indonesia, but from southern Kalimantan. So Kalimantan is, it's like the Indonesian name for Borneo, and Borneo is an island in Southeast Asia, which of like all, I think it's the third largest island in the world, and then Madagascar's the fourth. Some controversy if you include Australia as an island, because it's also a continent, but won't go into that. And essentially, there was actually a Scandinavian scholar who, I think it was in 1951, Otto Dahl. He wrote this book. I think it was called The Voyage from Kalimantan to Madagascar or something. And basically, what he did, he was a linguist, and he basically, in looking at Malagasy, the language, he unpacked the fact that it shares 90% of its basic vocabulary with Ma'anyan, which is a language that's spoken in Indonesia, in Borneo, which is fascinating. That because you would think, oh, it's probably like a similar, like a Bantu language from Mozambique or something, that they would share, these similarities, but it really wasn't the case. And since then, there's been like geneticists and bioscientists and all sorts of people, again, trying to uncover and essentially reconstruct the history of Madagascar and solve what's been called like, one of the unsolved puzzles of human history. With Madagascar's like 20 plus different ethnic groups, there's obviously immense diversity in terms of music on the island. My research on Madagascar and on Malagasy music was conducted like in 2017 when I was completing my master's degree. So my main focus, just because of the focus and framework of my research, was musical instruments. And with what I mentioned earlier about just Madagascar being this, this place of pre-colonial Indian Ocean contact, essentially, I thought in this like narrative where linguists and geneticists and archaeologists and everyone has sought to, try and reconstruct Madagascar's history of settlement, etc. I thought, what could the field of music do? And surely it could do something. Surely it could contribute towards answering the question, of Madagascar's earlier settlers. It's a fascinating question, and even for Malagasy people today, it's so important to know your history, So I sought to inquire, what can music do? And, with music, it would be great to say, hey, you know what? I actually have this, the CD or this tape, which was recorded around 700 AD. It's a beautiful recording. It was there on the beach. And so I'll send this to a linguist and be like, well, that's music's contribution. I hope you enjoy it. But obviously there were no recordings. There are no recordings from 700 AD or from 1000 AD or 1800 AD, recording has only been the last century or two. So what I sought to look at was musical instruments, right? Musical instruments, they're like a tangible aspect of music. So I could say that half an hour ago, I was here and I sang a performance, like a cappella performance, and I'll be like, can you still hear it? And you'll be like, no, I can't. But if I have an instrument here and I say, half an hour ago, I played this instrument in front of me. Even if I'm not actually playing it, at least you have something to go by. You can be like, oh, cool. Oh, okay, I can see, it's a tangible thing that you can see. And, when you don't have musical recordings, which obviously these days we do, but if you're looking at kind of reconstructing history or something like that, if you don't have recordings, instruments, they really do stand as this beautiful this tangible aspect of musical culture. And essentially one thing that I've been doing and that a lot of scholars or researchers or everything have been doing is looking at, I won't get too technical, but essentially comparative organology. Organology simply just being the study of musical instruments, and comparative being, it's basically comparing musical instruments. So for example, what you can do is you can look at an instrument from Kalimantan, southern Borneo, where linguists say, hey, their language is so similar to that. You can look there and be like, I wonder, are there any instruments that are there and that are in Madagascar and that are similar? In conducting, my master's research, etc., it's fascinating that there are. And I think more fascinating is you'll find that there's an instrument called the one that I had up earlier. It's called the vali. It's Valiha. The HA at the end you don't pronounce, so just vali. And it's this beautiful instrument it's kind of considered to be the national instrument of Madagascar. As you can see, it's a piece of bamboo and then there's strings all around it. And for example, an instrument like this, which the instrument type, again, not to get technical, it's called like a heterochord, a plucked zither. a tube zither because it's a tube, and a zither is like an instrument. You also get zithers in China, for example. There's instruments that they pluck. And yeah, it's essentially that. And if you look at this instrument type, it's found in 2 places in the world. 1 in Madagascar and 2 in Indonesia. It's not found anywhere else, just in those 2 places. Which is fascinating again because just of what it speaks about this, like cross-cultural contact between Madagascar and Southeast Asia. This instrument I won't play for you because it's not really a instrument to be played. As you can see, it's really like quite ornate and beautiful and beautifully designed and stuff, but it's more like a tourist kind of a curio. I have another one here, and all of the designs, they're kind of like really significant things in Madagascar, like symbolic things. This, for example, in this one, it's something called the alualu, which is essentially they're really beautiful. It's like a kind of a stone carving that you would have on a grave site, like on the gravesite of a person, and it would have, for example, if it was a man and he was a bus driver, but on this alualu you'd have, for example, a man driving a bus, so it would kind of show some things that were significant to them in their lives. And then even this one behind me, it's a nice big one. Again, it's all more like touristy kind of things, so it's not really to be played. And you'd have like national symbols, like the lemur is there. And yeah, just some, I don't think this one has it, but that you can't really see it, but baobabs, which are also like endemic, at least the big ones that they have, they're also endemic to, Madagascar and stuff. To go back to this notion of comparative organology and kind of looking at the instruments that are in Madagascar and how they speak of a history of Indian Ocean contact. So I mentioned the vali, then you have something like the sudina, which is it's essentially a flute, again a bamboo flute, which again you have one in Indonesia called the suling. But yeah, so you'd have like that flute, the sudina and the suling, which it's the same instrument, and you can see that shows this history of context from it's obviously complex to retrace that history, and you look at everything that's happened, and even with like the Indian Ocean slave trade, it's really important to look at things like that. It's again another history that's not often discussed and spoken about. But yeah, that's maybe a story for another day. And then you'd have another instrument, which is a stick zither called the zhezvotav. And the zhezvotav, it actually shows this. It's really similar to the zhezhe, which is an instrument from East Africa. It's essentially the same instrument, the one in Madagascar and the one in East Africa. And it's again one of those instruments that's not really found in many other places, besides East Africa and Madagascar. I was in Madagascar in 2017 for about 4 to 5 weeks for field work, and I discovered so much even about pronunciation, in the Malagasy language. But it's really fascinating. A lot of their words, you'll see it, you'll hear someone say it, and you're like, what? Like, that didn't correspond to what I'm seeing. But part of the reason is a lot of the words, they'll drop, like, say, the last syllable. So, for example, the vali, V-A-L-I-H-A, you would be like, oh, valiha, like that's what it's called. And they're like, no, take the ha away. So it's just the vali, for example. And then even, I mentioned earlier, the suling, which is the Indonesian flute. And then we would read it as S-O-D-I-N-A. So we would say sodina or something like that. But they actually pronounce that O as a U. So it's like sudina. I'm probably getting it wrong because I don't speak Malagasy, but it's something along those lines, like sudina, which is very close to suling, which is what's in Indonesia. So yeah, it's one of those things that even I mentioned earlier, it's read as jeji. You would read it as jeji votav or jeji voatav or something like that, and they're just like jej votav. And then 2 final examples which show like just this history of Indian Ocean contact. Is the anjomara, which is a reed pipe, or some would call like a oboe kind of thing. And again, you have it in Madagascar, and then you have some in like North Africa and particularly the Arabian Peninsula. It's called the Sorna or the Surna. There's like various different ones, and yeah, it's another fascinating thing. An instrument like that, for example, you don't have it where we are in South Africa, of course. So again, if there's an instrument that's there, it shows movements of people, migrations of people, and particularly just influence from cultures, from certain places, to the extent where today it forms part of Malagasy musical culture. And then just the final one in Madagascar, you have this lute that's often played. It's called the kabos, spelt with a Y, but it's a silent Y. And yeah, it's really similar to the lutes that are played in places like Yemen and Oman and the Arabian Peninsula, where they're called like the kanbus. There's one in Yemen, for example. And again, it just shows how Madagascar has been influenced, its musical culture has been influenced by its history of, its fascinating history of Indian Ocean contacts.